welcome one and all to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? I'm Ray Powell, and I'm joined by Jim Caruso. Jim, I am still in Manila, but I understand that you are in a much more scenic location.
I'm on the road in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. If you haven't been here, it is a beautiful place. If you've ever seen The Trouble with Harry, a Hitchcock movie from 70 years ago, with a prototypical New England town, this is the place. So I'm here, but I'm not dead being carried around by Alfred Hitchcock.
Well, that must be from your generation. I'm far too young to know that movie. But we are...
to our listeners, Ray.
We understand that when people are carried around in caskets, they're very well dressed, and our guest is very well dressed as compared with us. He is Dr. Prashanth Parmeswaran. He is the founder of the ASEAN Wonk newsletter, and if you are an ASEAN Wonk, or if you're very interested in Southeast Asia, you should definitely be subscribing. He's also a fellow at the Wilson Center and the senior columnist for The Diplomat, which is a very important Southeast Asia, but Asian geopolitics newsletter. And he is an instructor at the Foreign Service Institute for the Department of State. Prashanth Parmeswaran, I welcome you. And as the ASEAN Wonk, I want to know, why should we care? First of all, what is ASEAN, and why should we care if it is central? Why should we care about ASEAN centrality?
Well, I think it's a great place to start. And first of all, let me thank you, Ray and James, both for inviting me onto the podcast. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and you guys have had a terrific lineup of guests. I've really been enjoying listening to it. And both of you, I follow your work closely, Ray on the South China Sea, but also security issues and geopolitics more generally. And Jim, actually, I knew him from before when I was covering Southeast Asia for The Diplomat, but actually we also intersected at Bauer Group Asia, where Jim is a senior advisor currently as well. So I think the foundational question you asked, Ray, is kind of it's a very good place to start, the question of ASEAN centrality. So I think there's a lot of confusion sometimes about this term that gets thrown around, sometimes a little bit loosely. So ASEAN itself is not to be confused with Southeast Asia in terms of Southeast Asia, the region, which is nearly 700 million people, fifth largest economy in the world. ASEAN is a diplomatic grouping that started off actually in 1967 with only a few members, really half its size, and it's since sort of enlarged to comprise now 10 countries in Southeast Asia. So it's a diplomatic grouping and organization. And the notion of centrality revolves around the fact that actually, if you want the sort of official formal definition, ASEAN centrality actually appears in the ASEAN Charter, which governs ASEAN as an organization. And in that ASEAN Charter, ASEAN centrality is defined as the fact that the ASEAN sees itself as being the primary driving force in terms of Southeast Asia's management of its relations with external powers. So that's the United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, China, so on and so forth. And so, for example, if you apply this to the situation in the South China Sea, ASEAN doesn't see itself as being kind of the only game in town when it comes to manage the South China Sea disputes. But there is sort of an ASEAN track where ASEAN, through the claimant states in the South China Sea, but also other countries in Southeast Asia as well, with its dialogue partners and China, have a way of managing these issues, and that kind of sort of ascribes a kind of centrality. The other way in which we see it come up is the time when ASEAN gets the most attention is when all the leaders kind of descend into the Southeast Asian capital, depending on who's chairing ASEAN. And that actually is a really important point, because ASEAN, we can argue about the substantive nature of its centrality, but it does have this convening power that it's quite unique for regional organizations in Asia, because it really is the only game in town. So if you look at South Asia, you have SAARC, but it's been a lot of issues and problems, including India-Pakistan relations. You look at Northeast Asia, you've got dynamic where China, Japan, and South Korea, it's really hard to get any sort of organization going on there where all three of those countries agree. So Southeast Asia is really the game, the sort of primary game in town when it comes to convening these meetings as a kind of way for leaders to meet in the Indo-Pacific. So it does have that convening role. The big question is how much of that is about convening and symbolism versus the substantive nature of managing these big geopolitical issues that we're facing today.
Well, I think you put your finger on it, Prashanth. Defenders of ASEAN point out that ASEAN was established and there has been peace between the ASEAN members ever since. So that Whether it's direct cause and effect, I'm not sure, but it is coincident. So that's something. But unfortunately, even between the countries of ASEAN, they can't solve some of the big, hairy problems, most especially demarcation of boundaries in the South China Sea, which would go a long way to helping them deal with the Chinese claims, which runs counter. Why do you think they are unable amongst themselves, at least among the maritime states, to agree to some sort of code of conduct or methodology for demarcating their boundaries?
Yeah, I think it's a very complex question, and I think part of that is you do have to go back a little bit further to when ASEAN was founded, because ASEAN was founded out of necessity because you had a number of the Southeast Asian countries basically in some sort of conflict with each other. So at that point, Indonesia in the first half of the 1960s was basically conflict with Malaysia and sort of questioning its existence. Disagreements between Malaysia and the Philippines over the status of Sabah, which is now part of Malaysia, but technically that claim is still alive. And so partly Southeast Asia needed ASEAN as a diplomatic grouping, primarily to manage tensions between these countries themselves, which were quite fierce. And they're still there, right? So to your point, Jim, about the South China Sea and why it's hard for ASEAN to get its act together, a lot of the even founding members of ASEAN, the original members of ASEAN, have very different outlooks on how to manage this. So for the Philippines, the centrality of the U.S. alliance is there. Sometimes, when you had Rodrigo Duterte, there was less of an emphasis on that. But now under Ferdinand Marcos Jr., you're seeing that come to the fore. With Vietnam, it's tough to describe Vietnam's approach because they have a very unique relationship with China, different modes of engagement. But I would say the Vietnamese, in terms of military capabilities, I think even in Southeast Asia, you wouldn't get a lot of opposition if you said Vietnam would be probably the country that would be most able to militarily challenge China in terms of what happens in the South China Sea. All of them face huge asymmetries, but the Vietnamese epitomize this notion of self-help. So managing relations with the Chinese Communist Party, but also making sure their military capabilities are up to a task. Whereas, say, Malaysia, for example, has tended to rely much more on diplomatic channels of engagement with China. So Malaysia was the first country within ASEAN to actually normalize relations with China back in 1974. So it was a very early adopter of this notion of engaging China. Part of that is because the Malaysians see the opportunity in that, and a lot of that is economic. But I think if you speak to Malaysian officials privately, they will also concede the fact that Malaysia's military capabilities are much more limited relative to, say, a country like Vietnam. And so Malaysia tends to rely a lot less on the military aspect of engagement. And of course, Brunei is probably the one which I think sometimes I've been in conversations where Brunei is even left out of the conversation entirely. It is a claimant, but it manages these things very quietly. It obviously has a lot of actually military presence arrangements with countries like Britain. It's trying to do a lot more with Japan, more with the US. But they also have arrangements with China that they strike themselves in order to preserve their status as a very energy-rich country.
So, Prashanth, I want to go back about a decade to a Singaporean diplomat named Bilahari Kauskon. And I apologize to him if I've butchered his name, but he made a very famous speech now, I think, about ASEAN. And he said this: ASEAN is far from perfect. It certainly needs improvement, and there are many areas where its workings can be improved. But a cow never becomes a horse, and no matter how devoutly we may wish it, pigs are never going to grow wings. We have to accept a cow as a cow. A cow is quite a useful animal, so is a horse. But the usefulness of a cow is different from that of a horse. We should consider how we can improve the bovine breed, how we can make a better cow rather than scolding it for not being able to run as fast as a horse. And his point, of course, was that we are asking, or oftentimes you're expecting, ASEAN to do things it is simply not well designed to do. First of all, I mean, is it the case that just by sort of having this ASEAN Centrality bumper sticker, we are expecting the cow to be some combination of cow, horse, flying pig?
Well, because the cow keeps neighing or trying to neigh.
all of that, kick that over to you, Prashanth, and get your reaction.
And keep that metaphor in mind.
Will do. I mean, I think it's a, I have a lot of respect for Bilahari because, he was, for a long time, one of the most vocal diplomats, including during his time in the foreign ministry. And I think he, really is very upfront and candid about some of the major challenges of ASEAN. And I think the big problem, if we were to summarize it, Ray, the point that you were just making and Jim was building off on, is a problem of expectations management. I think when we're talking about geopolitical issues, so when we're talking about basic issues such as, for example, ASEAN's got hundreds of meetings every year where they deal with issues like education, health. These are tremendously important for the region in terms of functional issues, particularly a region where, these are very newly independent countries, right? Got their independence in the 50s and 60s. Lots of foundational issues, governance issues, corruption, so on and so forth. But when we're talking about big geopolitical issues like the South China Sea, if we're expecting, ASEAN to sort of resolve the South China Sea disputes, they have this ongoing conversation about a binding code of conduct between ASEAN and China. I don't think anyone that I've spoken to, at least in Southeast Asia among the diplomatic community, has any illusions that this is ultimately going to be resolved by a piece of paper, right? This is something which, the ASEAN track is one of several tracks that Southeast Asian states have going on in terms of managing this issue. But ultimately, it's going to be up to the claimant states. There are 11 countries in Southeast Asia. Only 4 countries have official claims. Indonesia has claims, but doesn't call itself a claimant. So it's less than half of the organization. At the same time, in ASEAN, you have this dynamic where, as in a lot of diplomatic groupings, right? When you say you should care more about the South China Sea for the claimant states, a lot of countries up in mainland Southeast Asia have questions about, well, why don't you do more about the Mekong subregion, right? Which refers to one of the longest and largest rivers in the world now, where China is basically the upstream country that's been constructing this big network of dams. We've been talking about this for over 20 years, but ASEAN really hasn't had that much of a forefront role in terms of managing these issues. Other issues, Myanmar, for example, which has always been a very divisive issue, these sprawling scam networks across Southeast Asia that have affected nearly every member state, that is crying out for a huge solution. So these big geopolitical issues, ASEAN is often found wanting. Some of that is because it's a diplomatic organization that operates by consensus. Now, consensus doesn't mean that everybody has to agree on everything, but it does mean that behind closed doors, you have to arrive at compromises. So we will do X on the South China Sea, but you need to do a little bit more on Y or Z. And you have a diverse group of countries, right? Sometimes military dictatorships, absolute monarchies, vigorous and unstable democracies, right? Socialist regimes, and they all have to come together, and they have a lot of tensions among themselves, right? Lots of hangups about Indonesia's role among Malaysia, Singapore in maritime Southeast Asia, and then in mainland Southeast Asia. A lot of people still remember Vietnam's invasion or occupation of Cambodia, right? So there's this whole notion about Vietnam and Thailand competing for regional leadership, but then Laos and Cambodia, the 2 smaller countries, also have their own reservations. So it's really tough to get these diplomatic accommodations to resolve these big issues. And of course, the last thing I should mention is there's often some comparison between ASEAN and the European Union. And I think that maybe flatters ASEAN a little bit too much. The sort of, if you look at the math, the EU has about 60 times the staff of the ASEAN Secretariat and about 9,000 times the budget. So the staff in the ASEAN Secretariat is measured in the hundreds, and it's got tens of millions. The Europeans have thousands, if not tens of thousands, at times, depending on how you count it, and their budgets run in the tens. And I think the last time I looked at it, it's almost 200 billion, the budget for the European Union. So. And it's really important to recognize as well. I think sometimes there's a bit of a misunderstanding. When ASEAN was set up, it was deliberately designed this way, right? It was designed to be an intergovernmental organization, not a supranational organization that pools sovereignty like the European Union, because of a lot of distrust in Southeast Asia about ASEAN being too powerful, right? So if ASEAN had a military or a peacekeeping force, well, might that be used for a election outcome that doesn't turn out so well in, say, Cambodia or the Philippines, right? So these countries, they want to have an organization that manages their differences, but they don't want an organization that's too strong to be able to manage these issues. And that's the institutional and structural reason why you have that.
But, part of the problem is there's this dichotomy between exactly what you're describing. That's ASEAN is not a security organization. It has very limited capabilities, but they really don't like anything that would interfere with the so-called centrality. So, for instance, when the Quad was set up between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, it was, oh my God, you're ignoring ASEAN centrality. And those of us who were in the region at the time kept saying, well, first of all, we don't even define what the Quad is. There's no secretariat. And secondly, you don't even talk about security within ASEAN. So how are you going to coordinate? There's no mechanism. Meanwhile, members like Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia are having their sovereignty violated. So they are against anyone doing anything. They don't do anything themselves, and they're losing.
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on a big challenge. It's a source of frustration for me as well, Jim. Because I think the way I see it, there's much more room for various organizations to take different pieces of this, right? So ASEAN has a very important role in terms of managing relations between Southeast Asian states and having that sort of track there for China to deal with ASEAN as a grouping. So that I think that's very useful, because if you don't have that, then the other countries that are not claimant states can say, well, this is just a Malaysia, Philippines, Vietnam, and Brunei problem. I mean, I, as Cambodia, don't really need to say anything. So if ASEAN has this rotating chairmanship system where, this year it's Laos, for example. And so if you don't have that mechanism of ASEAN having to deal with these big, tough geopolitical issues, Laos can just say, well, I don't really need to deal with this, right? Because there's no real ASEAN track on the South China Sea. So that's a really important internal device. But the other part, which I think is really critical, Jim, is to be able to understand that ASEAN is never really going to decisively shift the military balance of power, which is really at the heart of the South China Sea disputes, right? You have a situation where China is multiple times, in terms of its maritime capabilities, the total maritime capabilities of all of these Southeast Asian countries combined. And it was a situation where some of these countries don't even know what's going on fully in their own waters and have to rely on countries like the United States to help them. So the Quad has a tremendously important role in terms of addressing the military balance and the geopolitical balance in a way that ASEAN is not able to do. I think the other piece that's really important, that's been really interesting, is you did indeed, as you noted, Jim, see, particularly from the foreign ministries in Southeast Asia, sort of when the Quad came out, sort of notions about, is this going to overshadow ASEAN, right? The notion of ASEAN centrality. I think also there was a recognition among some of the defense establishments that, we'll wait and see. I mean, if the Quad turns out to be something where there's something in it for us, that the United States, Japan, and other countries are going to also increase their presence in Southeast Asia, that's something that could be a benefit to us. And I think it's been really interesting to see it. Even though the rhetoric has been a little bit troubling at the outset, if you look at some of the studies and polling that have been done by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, perceptions of the Quad started out being a little bit rough. So it was negatively perceived among the majority of some of these Southeast Asian countries, even among elites. But now, increasingly, a majority of countries now actually support the Quad in terms of the elites in these establishments. And part of that is because the Quad, even though it's still talking about these big issues like China, geopolitics, I think policymakers have been also able to sell the sort of public goods aspect of this. So the Quad, to put it a little bit more bluntly, so behind closed doors, you can talk about China and all this balance of power stuff. But in the public statements, you can talk about scholarships, you can talk about technology cooperation, and so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be an either or, right? And that and conversation rather than the or conversation, I think, has helped socialize the Quad in a better place. I think AUKUS, my sense is, and you guys, feel free to let me know what you think as well. It seems like AUKUS is in a much more earlier phase in terms of perceptions in Southeast Asia, particularly because Indonesia and Malaysia initially had a bit of a rougher reaction. They've kind of toned it down a little bit. But I think the Quad, for me at least, is a good example of how minilateral institutions can kind of adjust and socialize themselves over time to address these Southeast Asian concerns. And I think it's a really interesting case study. We'll have to see how that kind of evolves in the coming years, but it's been really interesting to watch.
One of the things you put in the most recent newsletter that I read was a Pew Research poll that looked at attitudes toward various major powers and their contributions to peace and stability around the world. And one of the things, of course, that stands out is how many of the ASEAN countries have a very positive, favorable view of China's role in promoting or contributing to peace and stability. And actually, one of the other things that stands out is India's role does not sort of, that's actually, suffers quite a bit in comparison. And of course, for those of us who live our lives, revolving around the South China Sea issue, this comes as a little bit of a surprise to see quite how positive these perceptions are. I mean, including even a majority of people in the Philippines, where you would think that maybe that would be, way underwater. So, what do you think accounts for this? And is there a disconnect between some of the elites in places like Manila, where I am right now, and just sort of general opinions around the region?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting and rich conversation on the issue of polling, because you have this. I mean, Gallup has done a couple of these now. Pew has done a couple of these. You have the IC's perceptions that come out almost on an annual basis now. They've done it for a few years, and all of them really have over the past few years shown an increase in terms of positive sentiment towards China and a little bit more ambivalence with respect to the United States. I think part of that is the fact that China is seen really as the kind of big country that's really been emerging in Southeast Asia over the past 2 decades in particular. So the notion is among a certain segment of the population and increasingly among the elites, the notion is that there will need to be some sort of accommodation made with China. And the question is really, what are the parameters of that accommodation? And that accommodation has to, without a balance of power that includes the United States, Australia, Japan, and other countries, these countries will have a much more difficult time arriving at that accommodation with China than not. So that, I think, is very much accounts for the elite piece of the conversation. But in terms of the public part of the conversation, I do think this relates as well to the various facets of China's influence. I think if you talk to anyone in the region about the next 20 or 30 years in terms of economic futures, China is really seen at the top of that conversation. Even though, as in your conversation with Ambassador Ted Osius, he rightly mentioned that the United States is still the largest foreign investor in Southeast Asia, in most of these countries. And actually, if you ask the publics how many people know that, there's actually a lot less percentage of that population. But everybody thinks about China as this big economic story and juggernaut that they need to sort of accommodate. So I think that partly accounts for the public part of that conversation. I will say, though, that, as I think all three of us have been in this dynamic where in Southeast Asia, it's often really important to watch what countries do as much, if not more, than what they say. I think there's a lot of accommodationist rhetoric that goes around in the region. And when you question officials about that, they kind of say, well, what do you expect from us? Big Brother is watching, right? But then when you watch what countries are actually doing, I mean, Malaysia is a great example of this that we were mentioning earlier. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has been talking about how China, it's a great country, a great civilization. But if you actually look at what Malaysia has been doing, we just, in the past week, actually, we just had a US-Malaysia exercise, Kuris Strike, where Australia was actually involved, and it was publicized for the first time in the history of the US-Malaysia relationship. There have been quiet deliveries of maritime security assistance to Malaysia. Malaysia just upgraded its relationship with Japan, and they held the first exercises since that upgrade earlier this year in February. They've talking about doing more exercises, including in the South China Sea itself. So there is a lot of rhetoric that you see that's accommodationist. I would actually expect that we would see a lot more of this as China's role grows in the region. But I would also say, as one official was saying in my recent trip, working on a follow-up report now for the Wilson Center, looking at all of the Southeast Asian countries and their position in US-China competition. So I traveled to 10 of the 11 countries within the last year. I wasn't able to go to Myanmar because of the situation there. But across the board, one of my summary insights from officials is really, when there's less of the United States, countries want more of the United States. And when there's more of China, countries want more of the United States. Right. So there is this dynamic as well, where the big question, if you go around the region, is really not this notion of, well, we know China is the top dog and we don't really think the United States is going to be relevant. It's more about, we're really anxious about what China is doing economically, and we want other actors. So US, Australia, Japan, Korea, European Union, we want all of these countries to do more so that we can preserve this balance, because not because we're doing a favor to the US or any of these countries, but because we want to preserve our sovereignty and our autonomy, and we don't want to be overly dependent on China.
Right. So they know they have to deal with China. They know that US and the others are balancing factors. They also should know, I'd be interested in your view, that when ASEAN works together, it's much more effective, and China hates it when ASEAN works as one, as opposed to being able to divide and conquer. So if ASEAN as a group worked with the Quad or these other minilaterals to really magnify the effect of any pronouncements and show that China has to deal with this as a unified group or somewhat unified, wouldn't that be better than this reveal and conceal crap that they're doing, where they want to badmouth the US and kiss up to China and quietly say, we don't mean it, we love you guys?
I think even among ASEAN officials, Jim, I think there is that recognition that there needs to be more than this conversation about the sort of, it's a zero sum, right? If it's the Quad versus ASEAN or AUKUS versus ASEAN, these minilaterals are really here to stay. And they're minilaterals not because countries just wake up one morning to decide to form new groupings. The reason why they're there is because they are responding to security challenges that are very vexing and are only growing every day. So there is a conversation. I think the best way to put it is, one ASEAN official said to me, Secretary Blinken has been talking about this notion of variable geometry, that the United States, we're involved in ASEAN, but we're also involved in the Quad. Expect us to be involved in multiple groupings over time. And this official said to me, we should be doing a lot more thinking, and we're trying to do that even within this conception of the ASEAN post-2025 community. They're drafting a vision of the next 20 years. The question should be, what is ASEAN's own variable geometry? So we've got our own institutions here, but how do we deal with the European Union? How do we deal with the Quad? And also, frankly, some ASEAN countries have expressed interest in joining the BRICS. Others are joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So this conversation about, ASEAN's the main game in town, and, we're going to kind of focus on that at the expense of other organizations, it's not really sustainable, even among the member states, because member states also want to be able to participate in these organizations. And that's actually very important. So I think that's one piece of that. I think the second piece of that that's really important is also ensuring that the organizations and institutions that are being founded ask a lot of specific questions about what are the agenda items that cooperation should be looked at between ASEAN and these countries, right? Because one of the things that's been really interesting in the last few years is ASEAN's been talking about more granular cooperation across things like electric vehicles, critical minerals, semiconductors, right? And there's a whole host of opportunities there to work with the Quad and other institutions on things that really don't involve these big geopolitical issues. It's not even a question of South China Sea. It's a question of everybody's thinking about these big economic sectors, right? So Laos has a great set of stakes on that, Cambodia as well. So why not actually engage these groupings in that conversation? I think there are a couple of obstacles to that. One is there does tend to be this notion that these groupings are primarily geopolitical. They're not geoeconomic, even though the big trend in the past decade, I think we can all agree, is the sort of lines between economics and security have been increasingly blurred. And so any notion of a community that's looking out to the next 20 years needs to adjust and account for that. And that's going to be really an important factor in terms of how ASEAN thinks about it. frankly, the other thing that needs to happen in ASEAN, which a lot of thinking is going into this, is ASEAN started out as being just a few countries. It's now doubled in size. They're thinking about bringing in East Timor as a full member as well, but they haven't really changed any of the rules or institutions and structures. So it's easier to come up with consensus with a smaller group of countries, but when you bring in less like-minded countries, you've got to think about being more flexible in these arrangements on geopolitical issues like the South China Sea. If we see that, I think we will see a lot more adaptive strategies among certain Southeast Asian countries in terms of how to deal with groupings like the Quad and so on and so forth. And in fact, the Quad is a great example because I think there were some issues and challenges in implementation, but during COVID, the notion of vaccines, for example, and vaccine distribution started to take hold. But now, obviously, we're in the post-COVID dynamics. So we need to ask the question, I mean, what is the next set of cooperative measures in a functional area look like? And I think there we can have a very productive conversation on those issues.
In order to do that, you talked about the size of the Secretariat and, sort of have been talking about really what is the bandwidth of ASEAN. And of course, now we're talking about, do we add more things to the pile of things that ASEAN is supposed to work on? Wouldn't it be helpful? And do you see any indication that ASEAN is looking at taking things off of its plate, in order to not be so spread out? I mean, we talked about these shortcomings on being able to deal with some of these really thorny geopolitical and security issues. What is there potentially a future there where ASEAN says, okay, we've got enough experience now to know that we're just not going to do those things, and so let's take those things off the plate, because frankly, we're not getting anywhere on them, and we have so many more constructive things we could do if we had the bandwidth.
Yeah, this is one which, I wish I could be more optimistic on. But the reality is that there have been a lot of conversations about exactly what you said, Ray, which is, I mean, this is an organization that has hundreds of meetings a year. There have been conversations about just streamlining the number of meetings. And even that's been a really difficult conversation to have, let alone the substance of the agenda, which I agree with you. You look at the communiques in ASEAN across the decades, they've just become very unwieldy. They've got to go into sub-paragraphs, sections now. Now they've got a statement that they issue, and they've got a chairman's statement, and sometimes the chairman's statement is different and markedly different from the actual joint statement. And so ideally, you would have really a rationalizing and streamlining of these functions. I think right now it's still very much this notion of three communities in ASEAN, which is the economic community, the political security community, and the social cultural community, which, if you talk to ASEAN officials, one said jokingly to me that, what has happened in practice is that the economic stuff, this is something which there's a very clear agenda on a set of issues. People can get to work on functional areas. The political security issues are really the big geopolitical issues that we're sort of talking about here that get dealt with. But the social cultural pillar has become this kind of like, everything else, put that in that basket, right? Civil society, democracy, the media, culture. And it's been really difficult to streamline that. And so one of the things that has happened on the positive side, if I'm trying to be optimistic here, is there has been this notion of pillars is really a little bit outdated. There are linkages, as I just mentioned earlier, between security issues and economic issues and so on and so forth. So we should have really a cross-pillar conversation about what are the issues that don't really fit neatly into this piece, and they need us to really address them because there's a big gap. So that's one thing that has happened that I think is really significant. The other thing that has happened, and ASEAN is considering as part of this forward-looking community building process, is how do we consolidate what we're thinking about with respect to ASEAN's own institutional architecture? So on security, for example, you have the ASEAN Regional Forum that's existed since the 1990s. But now if you ask most of the ASEAN officials about which gets the most traction in terms of security institutions, it's not the ARF, it's the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus with external dialogue partners. But the ARF continues to meet, right? And technically there are these competing institutions that exist. So you do have this dynamic where once you set up an institution, it's really hard to just do the kind of radical step to sort of close it, particularly in Southeast Asia, where there tends to be, people are very sensitive about doing these things that are very dramatic, right? It's often done in very understated, polite ways. So there is this dynamic of once you set up an institution, it just takes on a life of its own, even though the substance of the conversation may have moved on. But I definitely think that's a very important piece of the conversation because, you're going to add another 11th member, right? East Timor, right? And East Timor has a whole set of other matters that it's bringing into ASEAN, including the fact that it's the only Portuguese colony fully, right, within Southeast Asia. So you're going to be talking about relations with Portuguese language speaking countries, potentially a new economic agreement. And a lot of these other countries in Southeast Asia would be asking, well, what are the stakes for us? But there really isn't a way for that to actually be addressed because these issues take on a life of their own.
So I think your point that ASEAN badly needs reform is well taken. So I'm going to give you a hypothesis and let you react. General about to be President Prabowo of Indonesia is not a man of great patience, willing to deal with hundreds of meetings that never go anywhere. Indonesia, of course, is the 600-pound gorilla of ASEAN. If he decides to really lead in a new direction, do you think he can?
I mean, this is a really important question for us to be thinking about because I think I just came back, actually. I went to 6 Southeast Asian countries. I think in all of those conversations, Indonesia and Prabowo came up in terms of what does this actually mean for ASEAN relative to other issues in Southeast Asia. I think one piece of that conversation, Jim, is this scenario where Prabowo actually asked very serious questions about ASEAN and the issues like counterterrorism, for example, but also things like the situation in Gaza, for example, right? Very big geopolitical issues, South China Sea, where Indonesia has traditionally played a very active role, but under President Jokowi in the past decade, it has not. It's done a lot of its own measures. So that's one scenario which we could see. But to your point, Jim, about the fact that this is somebody who doesn't have a great deal of patience, not known for that, also extremely unpredictable, right? And so the other scenario that folks are thinking about is, might Prabowo try his hand at ASEAN, but also simultaneously try to engage much more in the kind of complex set of minilateral agreements, right? Not just US-led minilateral agreements, but minilateral agreements more generally on the economic side, on the security side, diplomatically. And we're talking about this in the context where we're seeing very significant developments, like the multinationalization of the Garuda Shield exercises. Used to be a US-Indonesia exercise, but now it's become not really there in terms of Cobra Gold and Thailand. But we're seeing this with Balikatan, for example. So Indonesia is becoming a hub of security activity and engagement. Prabowo does want to see a huge role for Indonesia on the global stage. So that's another scenario. And I think the third scenario that I think I found a lot of interest in the region is the scenario where, I know Ray was at the Shangri-La Dialogue this year where Prabowo talked about a plan for Gaza. Last year, he talked about a plan for Ukraine. And, we subsequently, found out that, that wasn't something that necessarily was a new Indonesian approved process, right? Didn't have a lot of agreement in the foreign ministry, for example. So the other thing that we could see is Prabowo announcing a lot of things, and the bureaucracy in Indonesia, which, a lot of Indonesia, sprawling democracy, right? 4th largest country in the world. Might this also be a little bit of a sort of stimulus or catalyst for reform within Indonesia, where the president is actually taking a large role in saying these things, and the agencies have to catch up and figure out how the situation comes forward, which makes for a very, very exciting sort of series of developments for Indonesian foreign policy, unlike what we've seen under President Jokowi, who has been more, I would say, domestic focused, economic focused. So it really is a very exciting part of the conversation. And as you said, Jim, it's really hard to picture a scenario where ASEAN does well without Indonesia doing well in terms of the global stage and external relations. Even though, as I was saying earlier, some countries in Southeast Asia, including Malaysia and Singapore, would say, well, we want Indonesia to be strong, but we also want to make sure Indonesia doesn't dominate wholly that piece of the conversation. So there'll be some checks to that as well, naturally, in Southeast Asia. But I think that's really the big leadership change that people are watching in the region to to come to the fore in the next year.
Well, that sets us up for a future discussion we plan to have, focusing in on Indonesia, and we'll just sort of preview that coming down the pike. Jim and I were talking about that just before we came on today. But I want to get you an exit question here on this, which is tell us about the ASEAN Wonk. How does one become the ASEAN Wonk? How did the newsletter sort of come to be, the Substack that you have, and what's the future? How does it look? Is it catching on, and what do you see in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a great experience doing this. So I actually set this up primarily because my story essentially was, as I mentioned, I came from Southeast Asia. I was in the region most of my life, and then I'm kind of used to hearing a lot about the Southeast Asia conversation. But here in Washington, in my different roles, I hear a lot of these big geopolitical stories. So China, Russia, Ukraine, South China Sea. And I really had an interest in how do we sort of figure out the connections and complexities and challenges in the intersection between what happens in Southeast Asia on foreign security policy and broader geopolitics and geoeconomics. And so that's the reason why I sort of set up the newsletter. It's a twice weekly publication now. It's going really well. I've actually been really surprised. When I started out, you never really know until you start something, as I'm sure Ray and Jim, you guys can be testament to that. I've been really, I shouldn't be surprised, but it's been really great to see, the range of guests you've had, the great conversations, and how much it's really been catching on. But we now have a very global audience across 6 continents now. So it's something where I think we've got something like 171 countries now covered. So not really the whole of the world, but very, very close to it. So it's really helped ushering in this kind of global conversation about ASEAN and Southeast Asia. And in terms of where it's headed, I think a lot of it started out as a weekly newsletter. I've ramped it up since to a twice weekly newsletter that includes a lot more. We do interviews, book reviews, and so on and so forth. So initially it started out as being primarily commentary and news and analysis. But now it's become a lot more, different and diversified content streams. And I think that's probably where it's going to be headed. And in the next few months, I've also gotten, in our conversation about ASEAN, actually, in my latest visit, one military official jokingly asked me, he said, why did you call it ASEAN Wonk instead of Southeast Asia? Are you implying that you privilege the diplomatic organization over the region? And of course, it doesn't. But it does also speak to the fact that a lot of people in the region are also watching this space very carefully. And that's been a really interesting experience, kind of working through these issues. And finally, the final thing I'll say is, this is also great for me because I do a lot of traveling to these regional capitals, and I do a lot of note-taking after my meetings. But this really forces me and disciplines me to, twice a week, sit down and really think about, what are these conversations actually amounting to, right? And what are the big picture conversations and issues, and how do you kind of streamline that? And so it's given me a lot of ideas about other things I could do as well, right? Other research products and writing and so on and so forth. So it's been a tremendous experience, particularly, first and foremost, really the replies that I get from practitioners who are actually saying, hey, this is great, but you missed X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, great, fantastic, because that's the way that you want these to be conversations, right? Rather than kind of a monologue of sorts. So that's been really interesting as well.
Well, that sounds like more fruitful and interesting conversations than I get to my posts on X, which usually just accuse me of being a CIA agent or some such. Prashanth Parmeswaran, you've been a fantastic guest. I really appreciate you helping us unpack this question of ASEAN centrality, because it's something that we run into, I think, on almost a daily basis, and it's important to kind of understand the contours. Want to give you any chance to where can people find your work if they're interested in subscribing? How do they do that?
Yeah, so you can go to ASEANWonk.com. That's ASEANWONK.com, and that is where you can find the newsletter. And of course, as Ray was mentioning, I also do some periodic writing as well for the Wilson Center and the Diplomat magazine. And we're always looking for speakers as well from the region and beyond for the Foreign Service Institute at the State Department. So feel free to contact me. I think some people have already saying, we would like much more conversation on X, Y, and Z. I always enjoy learning from those experiences, and no one can possibly know all of the range of issues across a very diverse region of nearly 700 million people. So it's always great to learn from those experiences as well.
All right. Well, Prashanth Parmeswaran, the ASEAN Wonk, thank you for joining us this morning, and we really appreciate your time.
Great to be with you both. Thank you so much.
All right, this is two wonks with another wonk talking about a wonky subject, but it actually matters.
I really think that I think he's more wonky than I am. I mean, first of all, he starts his name with doctor, so I don't even have what do they call those? The ceremonial doctorate, or the one that they give out.
Honorary.
Yeah, that one. I don't even have that one.
But you were a colonel.
Well, yeah. Colonels aren't known to be very wonky.
Okay, well, sometimes. Look, the interesting thing to me is ASEAN has very few defenders in the U.S., very few people who understand what it is. I actually had a former Secretary of State ask me, why do we even deal with ASEAN? Because, in fact, especially if you're Secretary of State, they are slow. They don't take strong positions on things we care about. They're good for giving money around, I guess. But it's like the UN. If it wasn't there, we'd have to invent it.
Yeah. So there was a Jakarta Post op-ed or editorial that came out this past week, and you could almost hear the eye rolling here in Manila, because it was chastising the government of the Philippines for not basically going around ASEAN and telling everybody all about the reciprocal access agreement they just signed with Japan. And given the fact, of course, that ASEAN has been very quiet on the Philippines' South China Sea issues, there's sort of this palpable sense of, oh, now you want to talk about security now, So yeah, I mean, I think really this question is, what does ASEAN do well? Why can't it mostly just do those things and not try to insinuate itself into things that it really doesn't do that well?
Well, it doesn't insinuate itself in things it doesn't do well, unless you consider the negotiation of the Code of Conduct, which has been a failure for 20 years? Although I'm told at the meeting last week they expect it now in 2026.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Hang on, wait. Let me hold my breath.
Yeah, exactly. Look, they're good they reduce tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, and trade between them. They cooperate on certain educational programs. So the sort of soft diplomacy stuff. But the hard power stuff, they're really not set up for.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I do hope, I really do hope that somehow they can get around to looking hard at these reforms and figure out, what should we put on the plate and what should we actually take off the plate. And I think Prashanth made it clear that is a tough thing for an organization like ASEAN to do, but boy, would it be helpful.
Well, if anyone can do it, it's a former general with a temper and no patience. But let me tell you my quick story, there I was story.
Yeah.
So I was the acting ambassador chargé d'affaires to ASEAN for a couple months in the lead up to the ASEAN summit. And, ASEAN has a lot of ambassadors accredited to it now. And because it's a big bureaucratic organization that doesn't do a lot of the hard stuff, they have to find a way to keep its ambassadors and their staffs occupied. So what they do is a lot of karaoke. A lot of karaoke. And as relatives with whom I'm staying here in Vermont will tell you, I can't sing.
I don't think that's actually required for karaoke. You don't actually have to be able to sing. Well,
I don't know. They seem to prefer not covering their ears and screaming in agony. So they went through all the ambassadors who had to sing something. And I sang Row, Row, Row Your Boat. Because I figured no one can screw that up. I don't think our diplomatic relations have recovered.
I'm not supposed to have a response to this, but I did have a karaoke story within an ASEAN country. So I was in Vietnam when we had the Pacific Air Force's commander, General Carlisle, came out, and we had a big dinner. And at the end, they brought out the karaoke machine, and the commanding general of the Vietnamese Air Defense Air Force got up and sang karaoke, and then essentially hands the microphone to General Carlisle, who had no interest whatsoever in doing a solo on the karaoke machine. So makes everybody else go up to the stage, and we together all sing the United States Air Force song, which was the closest we could come to actually singing karaoke. So you are not the only American diplomat to find yourself in that situation.
In a future episode, I will tell yet another karaoke story, which involves Elvis. So stay tuned.
All right. Well, with that warning, we will wind down for today, and want to thank Jim for joining me as usual. I always want to give a shout out to our producer Ian, who's doing great work and whose graphics on especially on his X account are getting more and more attention all the time. I just encountered one earlier this week at a conference here in Manila, and all of a sudden I see a huge Ian Ellis Jones graphic appear up on somebody's PowerPoint slides as they're briefing this huge conference. So Ian is doing fantastic work for us and fantastic work putting out geopolitical stories in a really compelling way. So if you're not following him on Twitter or X, you should really be doing that. And once again, thanks for joining us, and we'll be back again next week.